my knowledge, I beg you.
Ladies, gentlemen, and Harajim of all ages, what are you doing today in Diablo 4? Because for the vast majority of you, the answer is probably something to do with either leveling up or getting gear, legendaries and uniques, because you want to get more power, right? And then if I were to follow that by asking you how you plan to do this, well, I bet most of you are also going to say by doing dungeons and resetting them halfway through so that you can repeatedly do that part of the dungeon over and over and over again. But what if that's not the best way? The developers keep pushing out hotfix after hotfix that changes monster density in specific dungeons that the community keeps focusing all their attention on at once, and some people are getting pretty annoyed at this, but the question you should probably ask is, why are they doing this? Why are they making these changes? Well, to put it simply, dungeon resets are not the activity that they expected or that they want players to be grinding. This game is a grind fest, it's a big part of what the gameplay actually is, and if you are enjoying Diablo, it's because whether you can admit it or not, whether you like it or not, you actually do probably enjoy grindy video games. And of course, the developers were aware of this when they were creating the game, and so they made one specific activity that they expected you to grind the hell out of in order to get more power. An activity designed to give you experience and legendaries in pretty good amounts, but also some other really important stuff that they want you to have. One with tons of variety, a good bit of randomness too, and undeniably one that is more fun and more enjoyable than choosing a singular dungeon and shoving your face at the same monsters for 1 to 2 minutes and then resetting it. That activity is Nightmare Dungeons. You collect sigils. These are for a random dungeon from the pool. They have positive affixes, negative affixes, and the sigil levels decide the level of enemy monsters you'll find within. But the issue is, to a lot of players, farming for experience and loot is more about efficiency than variety and actual enjoyment of the game. And variety directly contradicts the concept of efficiency in this case. Until now, it's been pretty much agreed upon that resetting random dungeons is just better, both for experience and for loot as far as legendaries and uniques, and Nightmare Dungeons are just sort of okay for that, right? I mean, until a few days ago, you could actually get 20 million experience per hour by resetting one specific dungeon non-Nightmare, but then they patched that out, so how about now? Well, that's what we're here for today. I'm going to break down the rewards from Nightmare Dungeons, how they compare to normal dungeons with resets, both as far as experience and loot, and we'll talk about why you should probably consider doing Nightmare Dungeons sooner rather than later, no matter what, as well as a slight list of which ones are actually the best to do. That said, how good actually is the experience rate and the loot drops from Nightmare Dungeons? Well, an important thing to note at this point is that every Nightmare Dungeon will give you a couple of bonus drops at the end of it, and once you hit tier 20 and above, these are always guaranteed to have one legendary in them, which means you are guaranteed at least one legendary per Nightmare Dungeon run at that stage. This will surprisingly often actually be a unique as well. Some of the earliest ancestral Nightmare Dungeons that I've done gave me uniques that just jump-started my whole late game experience, and they're where the vast majority of my unique drops have come from, either the end screen rewards or even just as drops within Nightmare Dungeons. That said, the drop rates inside of the dungeons themselves are pretty much the same as their normal counterparts, aside from both higher level enemies having better drop rates and the magic find affix that increases drops too. So you get the normal amount of legendary potential a normal dungeon would give you, if not a little bit more, and then a bonus 1 guaranteed at the end. Not to mention that as far as experience goes, you can force Nightmare Dungeons to be of a tier with enemies that are at least 3 levels above you. That makes them worth 25% bonus experience, and as long as you can still clear that pretty quickly, the difference can actually make them worth as much as quote-unquote loot caves, if not even more in certain cases. Those cases? Well, most dungeons in the game can be Nightmare Dungeons, which means even the highest tier loot caves have a Nightmare equivalent that can have 25% bonus XP from higher level enemies, and can also have the magic find affix for bonus loot, meaning technically the specific combination would make the highest rate of both experience, legendaries, and uniques per run be really good Nightmare Dungeons on a good dungeon itself with those affixes and that sigil tier level, right? That's just a theory of all though, but so let's put it to the test and start comparing actual solid numbers. Before we dive into this, I will say that I tried to stick to generally good dungeons, not the tippity top tier so as not to skew the averages, but pretty good ones. But before that, I will also spend a bit now telling you what the best ones are depending on your goals. Usually the ones that give the most experience will not be the best for legendaries, because an experience experienced Nightmare Dungeon is just one with tons of monsters, densely packed, relatively easy to kill, right? Whereas for Legendary, it is more about actual completion time to make the maximum benefit of the guaranteed drop at the end. With that said, let's break down the really top tier experienced Nightmare Dungeons first, which are Alderwood in Skull's Glen. This is just a really dense dungeon with tons of easy to fight enemies. Ghoulron Canals in the Dry Steppes, as well as Onyx Hold in the Dry Steppes for the exact same reasons. Earthen Wound in Hawazar is extremely good for this as well, and then the tippity top best one is Blind Burrows, full of spiders and spider hosts, which just give you so many extra monsters to kill. A proper AoE clear build can clear that dungeon's first objective in about 2 minutes and 30 seconds, which would get them about 812,000 experience for doing so, with an extra 30 seconds being required to move forward and kill the boss too if you want to do that. That said, if you're just here for XP and you have a decent Nightmare Sigil for it, there is always the Nightmare Dungeon reset method that we talked about yesterday, in which you simply activate your sigil, enter the dungeon, leave the dungeon, then go to any other dungeon, any other one possible, and complete the first objective of that dungeon. Then go back to your actual target dungeon, and then any time from here until you log out next. Whenever you leave the dungeon, either through a portal or just by walking out through the entrance, it will instantly reset so you can go right back in and do it again. You can use that to complete the first objective on repeat to Blind Burrows every 2 minutes and 30 seconds, which would give you an absolutely nasty 19.4 million experience per hour if you do that, proving why this is just sort of the tippity toppest of them all. As for Legendaries then, the ones that you really want to focus on are the fastest clear times possible, as you get drop chance from enemies throughout the dungeon, but also the guaranteed legendary or unique at the end of it. The top tier legendary specific Nightmare Dungeons then to run are Malwood in the Fractured Peaks, as well as Lost Archives in the Fractured Peaks, then also Alderwood in Skull's Glen once again, but the big thing for these is that if you're doing it for legendaries, you just mostly ignore the regular enemies, focus the objectives, only stopping for elites for their higher drop rates. You complete these in 2 minutes or less if you're just after these objectives, and this doesn't really work with the reset method though, because it requires completion for the guaranteed legendary at the end that I mentioned, but these are the best ones for that process specifically. This is a general list though. Of course, your own experience will vary both for time and for effectiveness on your class and build. For example, for my specific build, monster density isn't quite as important as a sort of trail of monsters. It's built around getting a kill once every couple of seconds minimum, so if there is a trail of monsters one to the next from start to finish of the dungeon, just sort of 5 feet apart from each other, I'd actually complete that incredibly fast. So while this is a good general list that includes a good chunk of the dungeons, it should be applicable to most builds and most classes, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try some other ones just to see how they work for you specifically. For example, my personal best dungeon for XP is actually Whispering Pines. I completed that in about 3 minutes start to finish as a Nightmare Dungeon and got 900,000 experience for doing so, which if we extrapolate would be a clear 18 million experience per hour. Better than doing the current best XP farm loot caves, but this has the caveat that it would also require me to have an inventory full of Whispering Pines Nightmare Sigil specifically at the appropriate tier level with decent affixes enough to complete it in that time. So that's not really reasonable to expect. Instead, what I did to get a more reasonable number is just complete a good collection of different sigils I was having drop, prioritizing the dungeons I knew to be decently dense with uncomplicated layouts. My average across 10 of those was right around 13.1 million experience per hour, which is actually quite good, just under the top tier farm caves. But not only was I getting this while also upgrading my glyphs, which again is a really important avenue to player power increase that you should pay attention to. But each dungeon gives you one guaranteed legendary or unique at the end, as I mentioned earlier, and it also has a drop rate of 1 to 2 legendaries per dungeon run just on average, and I was completing one dungeon every 3 minutes and 40 seconds as an average between those. At a rate of 2 to 3 legendaries per run, that is 41 legendaries an hour, which again is just a little bit lower than the best legendary farming dungeons in the game. Some dungeons I was completing in 2 minutes at that rate of drops, some I was completing at 5 minutes with that rate of drops. If you were only doing the ones that were about 2-minute completions, if you worked out which ones are best for you and only did those, it could be as many as 60 all the way up to 75 legendaries per hour, which is obviously insane. But again, that would require a steady supply of perfect sigils, whereas I'm looking at averages here. To make a point that I wasn't only doing the very best dungeons to get these numbers, I did do Prison of Chaldeum, which honestly just really sucks for speed clearing. That one was 5 minutes for 630,000 experience, which is a really terrible rate, but that is factored into my averages, and again, we're still getting over 13 million per hour. That was one of my 10, and I still have 13 million per hour. With all that said, let's talk about the one big glaring reason that you should do Nightmare Dungeons, even regardless of what the numbers say. Paragon Glyphs. These are the little custom system knows that you can choose to stick into one socket on each of your Paragon boards, and while the Paragon system at a glance is a bit confusing, if you put a bit of time into it, look into it properly, it's actually relatively simple to understand. The big thing to pay attention to is that the glyphs are actually really important though. For example, let's take the exploit glyph that exists for every class. The primary effect is for every 5 dexterity purchased nearby this glyph socket, you gain bonus % damage against vulnerable enemies. That is great for every single class in the game. Everyone has some way of applying vulnerable, and it is an important effect to apply. So more damage against vulnerable enemies just is more damage, and this is a difficult stat to get otherwise on your gear, as there aren't multiple ways to get it, like vulnerable damage against healthy enemies or vulnerable damage against injured enemies. It's just plus vulnerable damage, right? Which makes it even more valuable to get from this source, because you can't really stack it otherwise, no matter what class you are. The obvious benefit to leveling up glyphs is at level 15, a glyph gains an expanded radius. This makes it so you can purchase more of the relevant stat and have it count towards the glyph. But on top of that, every time you level up one of your glyphs, the effect gets stronger. For example, at level 1, the exploit glyph gives you 1% bonus damage against vulnerable targets for every 5 dexterity within the radius. At level 10, this actually goes up to 2.35% for every 5 dexterity purchased. At level 15, this is 3.1% for every 5 dexterity, and at level 20, which is the max level currently for glyphs, this is 3.85%. In other words, the glyphs are quite powerful, and they get up to 4 times more powerful at max level than they are at base level, not to mention that the radius increase is a much larger potential increase to damage too. The thing is, leveling in Diablo is a bit of a trap. Yes, as you get to higher levels, you do better against higher level enemies, and one of the big achievements, one of the big things that makes you feel good is to get to level 100. But the general world around you scales based upon your level, right? So gaining levels doesn't really gain power in anything except for Nightmare Dungeons, where they aren't set to scale with you. But you know what can gain you tons of power without scaling your enemies equally by leveling? Glyph upgrading. It's a big deal if for no other reason than that, and sooner rather than later, you honestly want all the glyphs that you are using in your build upgraded as much as you physically can for the big power boost that it gives you. So for that reason alone, Nightmare Dungeons actually do deserve your attention, even if only just to make your other farm techniques faster, right?
This will only make me stronger.
To really sum it up then, Nightmare Dungeons, if you're just doing relatively good ones, are only a fraction less experience than pure experience farm. Also a fraction less legendaries than pure legendaries, but again, if you get a particularly good sigil, if you get a pile of particularly good sigils, they can be notably more experience and legendaries than either of those top tier farm methods, and on top of that, you get to level up your glyphs while you do it. I know, plenty of players have been mostly ignoring that function. On top of that, even further, you get variety. It is really easy to get bored or burnt out on the game really quickly, even a couple weeks in, if you're just trying to farm the one most efficient way, and the most efficient way is to just do the same first objective of the same dungeon over and over and over again. Wouldn't it be nicer to do 8 to 10 dungeons in rotation depending on which sigils you get, actually complete them, get further rewards, and get to experience more of the game at the same time too? The thing is, if you have an inventory full of nightmare sigils for your personal build's most efficient dungeon, it genuinely is the best way to farm both experience and legendaries. It is better than any of the other methods of the game. So there is efficiency to be found here if you get the right sigils. It's just the randomness of these sigils that brings it down a touch from being by far the best farm in the game to just one of the better ones. But when you factor in glyphs and also variety, I think it's totally worth doing, especially if you're just tired of sticking your face in the same places over and over again and resetting in the middle, and I think more people should be spending more time in Nightmare Dungeons. I hope you've enjoyed this video then. It's a bit of a breakdown of why people aren't doing Nightmare Dungeons, why you should probably consider doing more Nightmare Dungeons, which of the Nightmare Dungeons are particularly worth running in general, though again, it will be a bit different for each build, and then a bit of a more numerical breakdown of Nightmare Dungeon rewards compared to other methods of farming, both experience and legendaries. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.